When Jungkook says, "Some friendships change," and Taehyung only nods, a decade of silent truths begins to unravel beneath the surface. "You don't have to say it," Taehyung muttered, his voice hoarse, eyes fixed on the cold studio floor. "I already know." The air between them buzzed with everything unsaid, thick like static before a summer storm. Jungkook stood just a few feet away, his shoulders tense beneath the weight of too many rehearsals, too many words held back, too many years of walking the line between comfort and conflict. His hand trembled slightly as he tightened the cap on his water bottle, not because of nerves, but because he knew that whatever came next might change everything. "Some friendships change," Jungkook finally said, quietly, like a confession not loud, not cruel, but final. Taehyung just nodded. The studio's fluorescent lights reflected off the mirrors surrounding them, throwing back two distorted versions of themselves. Not the laughing boys they had been during Run or the young men who whispered promises during Spring Day, but strangers. Worn, quieter, shaped by time. The silence stretched. "I hated that you stopped calling," Jungkook added after a beat, his voice now heavier, like it carried the weight of late-night hotel rooms and messages left unread. "But I think I hated more that I understood why." Taehyung didn't move, his jaw tight, knuckles pressed white against the edge of the keyboard table. "Do you think I didn't miss you?" His voice cracked like a record scratched by dust. "I just didn't know if I had the right to, anymore." Jungkook turned slowly. "Why?" Taehyung finally looked up. The mask slipped. Beneath the curated expression was a face filled with regret, memories, and something deeper, something broken. "Because when I needed you most, I chose silence instead, and you moved on." The room seemed to shrink around them. The bass line from the next studio bled through the walls, a distant heartbeat echoing behind their confrontation. Jungkook took a step forward. "I didn't move on, Tae. I just survived, the same way you did." He remembered the night everything began to shift. 2 years ago. A red carpet event, flashbulbs, interviews, a small joke from a host that wasn't funny to them, but laughed off by the crowd. And then, Taehyung's cold shoulder backstage. That was the first fracture. The first time Jungkook realized something delicate had begun to crack. Since then, it was a slow unraveling. Shared glances turned into avoided eye contact. Group chats once filled with memes became silent archives. Words replaced by rehearsed smiles for fans, the closeness replaced by professionalism. And yet, here they were. Taehyung laughed, bitter and low. "I still play your solo track sometimes. Alone. It makes me feel like I didn't lose everything." Jungkook's throat clenched. He hadn't prepared for this. Not for the vulnerability, not for the aching, open wound of it all. "Do you want to fix this?" he asked, unsure if he even had the right to hope. "I don't know if we can fix it," Taehyung replied honestly, "but I don't want to keep pretending it's not broken." Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then louder, the kind that turned Seoul into a mirror of neon and water. The studio windows fogged with condensation, mirroring the haze inside their chests. "I still remember what you told me before our first world tour," Jungkook whispered, stepping closer. "You said, no matter what happens, we'll always have each other's back. I think about that more than I should." Taehyung smiled for the first time, but it was the kind that hurt. "I was naive. I thought time would never change us." "Time doesn't change everything," Jungkook said. "Sometimes people do." Their eyes locked. The air was heavy with truth. Neither of them needed to say it, but they both knew what had broken between them wasn't just a friendship. It was the illusion of permanence. The belief that some bonds are immune to life, distance, careers, heartbreaks, and misunderstandings. "I still care about you," Jungkook said quietly. Taehyung looked down at his hands, then back at Jungkook. "Then let's start with that. Not pretending, just caring." They didn't hug. They didn't cry. There were no dramatic reconciliations. But for the first time in years, they stood in the same room, with nothing but honesty between them. Outside, the rain fell harder, as if the sky, too, was tired of holding it all in. The soft hum of the city faded behind the insulated glass of the studio as Taehyung turned away, walking toward the wall where his coat still hung. His fingers hesitated at the sleeve, brushing the fabric but not pulling it down. Jungkook remained behind him, unmoving, watching the rise and fall of Taehyung's shoulders, as though every breath was a quiet war, between wanting to walk out and wanting to stay. The silence wasn't tense anymore, it was fragile. "Do you remember that night in Osaka?" Jungkook said suddenly, voice low, like he wasn't sure if it was a question or a plea. "The rooftop, the fireworks." Taehyung's hand froze mid-movement. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable, eyes glassy with memories. "The ones that kept misfiring?" he asked, a ghost of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. Jungkook nodded, something cracking open in his chest. "Yeah, we laughed so hard we nearly got kicked out of the hotel. That was the last time we weren't afraid of what we'd become," Taehyung whispered. Neither of them spoke for a moment, letting the weight of that realization fill the room. The years had stolen so many things: time, trust, words they should have said but they hadn't yet taken the memories. And somehow, that felt more painful than if they had. Jungkook stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "I've spent so long thinking you hated me." "I didn't," Taehyung said, barely audible. "I hated that I didn't know how to be around you anymore. Every time I looked at you, I remembered everything we used to be, and everything we weren't anymore." His voice shook. "I thought it was easier to stay away than to try and pretend." "But you never told me," Jungkook replied, eyes searching his face. "You just disappeared. Messages stopped. Calls went unanswered. You left me wondering if I'd done something unforgivable. I didn't know how to explain what I didn't even understand," Taehyung admitted. "I thought distance would give me clarity, but all it did was make the silence louder." They were standing inches apart now, close enough to feel the warmth of each other's breath. Jungkook reached out, his fingers brushing Taehyung's wrist like a question, like an apology, like he didn't want to break the moment but didn't know how to hold it either. "I miss my best friend," Jungkook said. Taehyung's eyes glistened. "So did I." It was startling how simple the words were, how deeply they hurt, because the pain wasn't just from anger or betrayal. It came from love, from how much they had meant to each other, how much they still did, underneath the dust of time and miscommunication. Jungkook pulled away slightly, letting his hand fall back to his side, unsure of the next step. "Do you think we can go back?" Taehyung inhaled, then slowly shook his head. "I don't think we should. Going back would mean erasing everything that's happened. We can't pretend we didn't change. But this didn't change." He paused, then added, "But maybe we can move forward, differently, honestly." Jungkook stared at him for a long beat, then smiled, soft and broken. "I'd like that." The studio door creaked as it opened, a manager poking his head in, clearly caught between professionalism and curiosity. "You guys heading out soon?" Taehyung turned, glancing at Jungkook before replying. "Yeah, just wrapping up." The manager gave a short nod and disappeared again, leaving the two of them suspended in a moment that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Jungkook looked around the studio, the scuff marks on the floor from hours of choreography, the water bottles half empty, the lingering echo of music they used to make together. Funny how this room saw everything. Taehyung followed his gaze. It really did. Fights, laughs, secrets, regrets, Jungkook added. Taehyung nodded slowly, then looked back at him. And maybe healing, too. They gathered their things in silence, the kind that didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like rain on dry earth, strange at first, but promising something new. As they stepped out into the hallway, fluorescent lights flickering above them, their steps unconsciously aligned. "Do you still write?" Jungkook asked as they walked toward the exit. Taehyung tilted his head. "Sometimes, when I can't sleep." "You never shared them." "I didn't think you wanted to read them." Jungkook smiled. "I do now." They stepped out into the rain, the cold air biting against their cheeks. The city around them was alive, horns honking in the distance, the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, the glow of neon signs cutting through the drizzle. "Wanna grab a coffee?" Jungkook asked, his voice casual, almost like old times. Taehyung glanced sideways at him. "You still drink that overly sweet vanilla thing? You still judge me for it?" Taehyung gave a small laugh. "Absolutely." They turned the corner together, the past walking behind them like a quiet shadow, not forgotten, but no longer in control. The streets felt familiar, yet new, like everything could start again. Not from where they left off, but from where they stood now. It wouldn't be easy. They both knew that. There were still things they hadn't said, still wounds that needed tending. But in that moment, beneath the grey sky of soul and the rhythm of the falling rain, they chose not to run anymore. Because sometimes friendships change. but that doesn't mean they have to end. The quiet chime of the cafe door broke the rhythm of the rain outside as they stepped in, droplets clinging to their jackets and hair, the cold air following behind them for just a moment, before being swallowed by the warmth inside. It smelled of roasted beans, faint cinnamon, and something strangely nostalgic. Taehyung glanced around first, scanning for a corner that was dim and far from the windows. He didn't need recognition tonight. He didn't want it. All he wanted was a moment that felt untouched by cameras or stage lights, or the weight of everything their names had become. Jungkook walked a few paces behind, watching the way Taehyung's shoulders seemed to carry years that had passed too quickly. The barista blinked, eyes darting between them, recognition flickering, but something in the heaviness of the atmosphere kept her silent. She simply nodded, gave a nervous smile, and turned to the espresso machine. Maybe she knew better than to interrupt. They found a seat near the back, beside a dusty bookshelf that leaned slightly to the left. A quiet booth, lit by a low-hanging bulb that flickered just enough to feel real. Jungkook slid into the seat across from him, brushing his damp hair back, exhaling deeply like he hadn't breathed right in days. Taehyung sat with one hand wrapped around his cup, staring into the foam like it might explain everything he didn't know how to say. "I've thought about this a million times," Jungkook started, voice soft, steady. "How it would go if we ever sat down again like this. What I'd say. How I'd say it. And?" Taehyung didn't look up. "I never imagined you'd actually show up." Taehyung smiled, without humor. "I didn't imagine I'd have the courage." Their drinks arrived. Jungkook's was sickeningly sweet. Still, with too much whipped cream and a dusting of something that looked like chocolate but probably wasn't. Taehyung's was plain black, no sugar. Jungkook smirked, tilting his cup. "Some things don't change." "Some things do," Taehyung said, then looked up, meeting Jungkook's eyes. "You've grown colder, quiet, like there's always something locked behind your teeth." Jungkook blinked slowly, then nodded. "And you've gotten better at pretending nothing affects you." The honesty was sharp, but not cruel. It was the kind of truth that hurt because it knew where the scars were. Taehyung looked down again, stirring his drink, though it didn't need it. "Do you remember the night we got lost in Tokyo?" Jungkook asked, his voice shifting, softer now. "That alley with all the red lanterns. You told me you'd never felt more free." "I remember," Taehyung said. "It was the first time I thought, maybe we weren't just what people saw." "Were we?" Jungkook leaned forward, the question hanging between them like fog. Taehyung didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, eyes flickering across the bookshelf beside them, as if the spines of old novels held the answer. "I think we were everything," he said at last. "And then we became nothing, because we couldn't hold everything without breaking." Jungkook didn't flinch. He just sipped his drink, watching him over the rim. "I missed the way we used to talk, the way we didn't have to filter every word." "Do you remember when we talked about living together?" Taehyung asked. "You said we'd never get anything done, just games and ramen and music at 3 a.m. I still think that would have been the best kind of chaos. But we never did," Taehyung murmured. "No," Jungkook said. "We didn't." Their silences were no longer awkward. They were necessary, like breaths between lines in a song that neither had finished writing. The rain outside slowed, now only tapping gently against the windows. The city moved on as if unaware that two boys who had once sworn forever were sitting in a coffee shop, trying to find their way back through a decade of misplaced words. Taehyung pulled out his phone, placed it on the table face down. Jungkook raised a brow. "I deleted your number once," Taehyung said suddenly. "Not because I was angry, I just couldn't stand seeing it there, knowing I wouldn't use it." "You could have," Jungkook whispered. "I would have answered." "I wasn't sure," Taehyung admitted. "There was this space between us that kept growing, and the longer I waited, the more I felt like I didn't belong in your life anymore." Jungkook reached across the table, fingers brushing Taehyung's hand just barely. "You always belonged, you just didn't believe it." Their eyes locked again. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't dramatic. It was real, raw, two souls, trying to understand if they were still allowed to know each other, without the filters of fame and pride. They sat like that for a while, the coffee growing cold, words finally flowing. They spoke of music, of plans they'd abandoned, of things they never shared during the tours. Jungkook admitted how lonely it felt to succeed without the person who once made every rehearsal feel like a promise. Taehyung shared how he'd laughed at interviews, but cried afterward in cars with tinted windows. They both avoided speaking about the exact moment things broke. It was too fragile, too layered, but they walked carefully around it, like bruises healing from the inside out. When the clock struck midnight, they were still there. "I don't expect us to go back to how it was," Taehyung said, cradling the empty cup in both hands now. "But I do hope, maybe, we can still write something new." Jungkook's gaze lingered, something soft flashing through it. "We already are." And just like that, it wasn't about salvaging the past anymore. It was about recognizing that some friendships don't stay the same, but the ones that matter can evolve. They can change forms, shift into something more real, more honest. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. The pavement reflected the moonlight, and the city felt quiet, in a way that only happened once in a blue moon. As they stood to leave, Jungkook grabbed a napkin and scribbled something on it. He handed it to Taehyung without a word. Taehyung looked down. It was his number. Again, written like an offering, simple and hopeful. This time, he didn't hesitate. He slipped it into his coat pocket and smiled, not the empty kind, but the kind that hinted at old songs and forgotten laughter, and the belief that not everything beautiful has to end. They stepped back into the night, and for the first time in years, walked side by side without the need to perform. Just two people, changed, hurt, healing, but still trying. And that, in the end, was enough. Under the softened glow of a distant streetlight, their footsteps fell in quiet synchrony along the narrow sidewalk. The rain had ceased, but the scent of it lingered in the air, earthy and clean, mingling with the faint aroma of distant grilled food stands and the electric hum of Seoul's sleeping corners. Jungkook's hands were buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, his eyes flicking upward every so often to watch the steam rise from the manhole covers. Beside him, Taehyung walked slowly, like he wasn't quite ready to part ways, but also not sure how much longer he was allowed to stay in Jungkook's orbit. Neither of them said a word for several blocks. It wasn't awkward, not anymore. The silence between them had softened, shed its sharp edges. It breathed, it gave space. Eventually, Jungkook spoke, his voice low and a little hesitant. "Do you remember that tiny music shop near the Han River? The one we used to sneak off to during practice breaks?" Taehyung gave a short breath, the hint of a smile on his lips. "The one with the old man who played saxophone every time we walked in?" "Yeah," Jungkook said. "I went back once, a few months ago." Taehyung turned his head, curiosity glinting in his eyes. "Is it still there?" Jungkook nodded. "Barely. He's older now, doesn't play much, but he remembered us. Called you the boy, with the eyes full of dreams." Taehyung laughed quietly, but his gaze went distant. "Back then, I thought we could chase anything, and never get tired." Jungkook slowed his pace, the memory of those days tugging something deep in his chest. "We were fearless, maybe too much, maybe just enough," Taehyung countered. "But something shifted, not just between us, in everything. The fame, the pressure, it all started to take pieces of us we didn't realize we were giving away." Jungkook's jaw clenched slightly. "You're right. And we didn't notice until we looked in the mirror and didn't recognize who was staring back." They stopped at a red light. Across the street, a bakery was still lit inside, someone cleaning the counters, stacking trays. It was strangely comforting, the reminder that life carried on in small ways while they stood here trying to pick up pieces of something much larger. Taehyung glanced at Jungkook. "Were you angry at me?" Jungkook didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the glowing red pedestrian sign. "Yes," he said, honestly, "but not the kind of anger that burns, the kind that aches. I kept wondering what I did wrong." "You didn't," Taehyung said quickly. "It was me. I got overwhelmed and I withdrew. I didn't know how to say, 'I'm hurting.' So I said nothing, and in that silence, I lost you." The light turned green. They didn't move. Jungkook's voice broke gently. "I needed you, and when you disappeared, I started questioning everything." Taehyung turned to face him completely now. "I never stopped needing you too, but I convinced myself I was just a burden. You were growing so fast, going solo, achieving so much. I thought I'd only hold you back." Jungkook's brows furrowed. "Hold me back? Tae, I used to look for you in every crowd. You grounded me." "I didn't feel like I deserved to anymore," Taehyung whispered. There it was. The root of it all. The unspoken self-doubt that had dug its claws into them both. Neither had known how to say they were drowning, not in the spotlight, but in the space between who they used to be and who they were expected to become. Jungkook reached out, resting a hand on Taehyung's shoulder. We both forgot how to just be us. Taehyung nodded, swallowing hard. Do you think we can learn again? I want to, Jungkook said. But it has to be real this time. No pretending, no hiding. Taehyung took a slow breath. Then let's start over. As who we are now, not who we were. They walked again. Quieter now, but lighter. As if saying everything had finally released the weight they didn't realize they were dragging through the years. The skyline of the city loomed in the distance, and ahead of them, the edge of the Han River came into view, reflecting silver ripples beneath the moonlight. They made their way down the familiar trail that curved along the water, the same one they had once run laughing through at 2 in the morning after a long recording session. There was an old bench, still there, tucked beneath a canopy of trees that had grown fuller since those early days. Jungkook sat first. Taehyung followed. The river whispered softly beside them. I wrote something, Jungkook said, pulling out his phone. A song. It's unfinished. I never showed anyone. Taehyung raised a brow. Can I hear it? Jungkook hesitated, then tapped play. The melody was haunting. Gentle piano. A steady, vulnerable beat. His voice came through the speaker, low and trembling, rawer than anything Taehyung had heard from him in years. The lyrics spoke of change, of broken connections, of old laughter echoing in empty rooms, of the ache of wanting to reach out but being too afraid of silence. And then, in the last verse, it shifted subtly, the tone warmer, a tentative hope, the line that hit hardest. If I turn around and find you waiting, I swear I'll never walk away again. When the song ended, there was nothing but the hum of the river and the wind between them. Taehyung wiped his eye quickly. That's the most honest thing you've ever written. Jungkook looked at him. I wrote it for you. I know. They sat there until the sky began to lighten ever so slightly, the early edges of dawn creeping into the world around them. The city was beginning to stir again, cars humming faintly in the distance, birds rustling in the trees above. A quiet rebirth. We should go, Taehyung said, standing slowly, brushing off his coat. Where? Wherever you're going, he replied, offering a hand. Jungkook looked at it, then smiled, genuine, open, unguarded. He took it. They didn't make any promises. They didn't need to. This wasn't about returning to the past. It was about walking into a future where both of them could breathe together or apart with understanding, with forgiveness, and with the deep abiding knowledge that no matter how much things changed, some bonds, even when tested, never truly broke. As they walked side by side into the quiet light of morning, neither said goodbye. They didn't have to. They had already begun again. The soft morning light bled slowly into the city like a memory returning home after being gone too long. Pale gold stretched across the tops of buildings and danced on the river's gentle ripples, casting reflections that wavered with the wind. The sky was still half asleep, a canvas of fading stars and lazy clouds. And there they were, Jungkook and Taehyung walking along the path they once ran through, without fear, without consequence, without the weight of the years between them. The silence between them wasn't filled with questions anymore. It was warm, quietly comforting, like a familiar song playing in the background of an unfamiliar scene. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. After everything that had been said through music, glances, broken laughter, and confessions too long buried, it was the silence that healed most. They turned a corner near a line of trees where the city noise dulled to a murmur. There, hidden behind thick branches and vines, stood the rusted remains of a fence where they once carved initials after a late-night shoot. Taehyung stopped first, his hand reaching out to brush the moss-covered iron. The letters had faded. Time and rain had nearly erased them. But if you knew where to look, you'd see the JK+V scratched into the metal, half a joke, half a promise. I thought it would be gone, Taehyung whispered, running his fingers over the worn surface. I didn't think anything we made would survive. Jungkook stood behind him, watching the way his hand trembled slightly. Some things survive, even when we try to forget them. There was a beat, and then Taehyung turned around, his back against the cold fence, eyes searching Jungkook's face as if to confirm that this wasn't a dream, that the boy he laughed with, cried with, nearly lost, was truly here, alive, listening.
I blamed you, Taehyung said softly, like the words had waited too long to be spoken. For things that weren't your fault. I blamed you for leaving, even though I was the one who pulled away. Jungkook looked at him, no anger in his eyes, only something sad and deep. I know, and I blamed you too. I thought you chose the world over us. Maybe I did for a while. Taehyung didn't flinch from the truth. But I was scared of being too close and getting hurt again, so I pushed you away before you could do it first. Jungkook nodded slowly, stepping closer until there was barely any distance between them. It's strange, he said, how people can be side by side in the same room, singing the same song and still feel miles apart. Taehyung's throat tightened. I hated pretending, smiling on camera, pretending everything was fine, but I thought if I kept smiling maybe I could believe it. But we didn't believe it, Jungkook replied. We were just trying to survive it. The wind picked up, swirling leaves around their feet like a small, fleeting dance. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car passed. But here, in this moment, the world slowed just enough for two friends to finally stand still with everything they'd buried between them now laid bare. Taehyung leaned his head back against the fence, closing his eyes for a second. Do you think people ever really go back to the way things were? No, Jungkook said, but maybe that's okay. Maybe what comes next is even better. Taehyung opened his eyes and looked at him, not just looked but saw him, really saw him. The lines of exhaustion beneath his eyes, the way he stood like someone who had learned to hold his own weight, the way his voice had changed, lower now, softer, but steady. You've changed, Taehyung murmured. So have you, Jungkook replied. Good or bad? Different, Jungkook said, smiling faintly, but not wrong. They didn't move for a long while. Just stood there in the silence of the early morning, in the shadow of an old fence with carved letters and old wounds. Then Jungkook stepped back, exhaling deeply. Come with me, he said. Where? Jungkook smiled, that spark of mischief returning for the first time in years. Somewhere I haven't taken anyone in a long time. Taehyung hesitated for a second, then followed. They walked past the river, down alleys lined with tiny restaurants just beginning to open. The scent of boiling broth and sesame oil followed them. People were beginning to wake, bikers on their early routes, old men sweeping storefronts, sleepy-eyed students dragging their feet to buses. No one paid them much attention. Here, in this corner of the city, they were just two boys walking with purpose. Eventually, they arrived at a small apartment complex, its exterior worn but familiar. Jungkook keyed in a code and pushed open the door. Inside, the hallway was narrow, lit by flickering bulbs, walls plastered with delivery menus and faded notices. They climbed 3 flights of stairs, neither speaking, just breathing, just existing in the shared rhythm of footsteps and heartbeat. The door opened to a small studio, cozy, sparse. A single bed, a keyboard by the window, notebooks scattered across a low table, the kind of space where memories could be rebuilt without pressure. Jungkook gestured toward the couch. I come here when I need to be nobody, he said. No expectations, no spotlight, just music. Taehyung sat slowly, glancing around. I didn't know you still needed a place like this. I do, Jungkook said. Maybe always will. He moved toward the keyboard, flipping open a notebook and pressing a few keys. A soft melody spilled out, tentative at first, then stronger. Taehyung closed his eyes and listened. It was a song without words, just chords and air. But in it he heard everything they hadn't said in the years they drifted, apologies, laughter, silence, pain, and then hope, gentle and unforced. When it ended, Jungkook looked over his shoulder. Help me finish it. Taehyung nodded. And that's how it began again, not with a grand announcement, not with a press release, but with 2 voices in a room writing something new. There were late nights filled with melodies and inside jokes. There were pauses filled with laughter and some with tears. There were lyrics rewritten, chords debated, silence respected. In that small studio, they found pieces of themselves again, not the boys they once were, but the men they had become, flawed, changed, but willing. It didn't fix everything overnight. There were still moments of distance, days where the past crept in with its heavy footsteps, but they talked now, openly, honestly, and slowly what was broken began to reshape itself into something honest, something whole. And when the day came that they stepped back into a rehearsal room with the rest of the members watching, unsure, Taehyung stood beside Jungkook, not out of obligation but choice. They exchanged a glance, a nod. And when the music started, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that, they both knew, was more than enough. When the rehearsal ended, the room remained suspended in a thick, breathless quiet. No one moved. No one spoke. The final note still lingered in the air, hanging between them like a question neither of them had the words for. Jungkook's fingers slowly loosened from the mic he'd gripped too hard, the imprint of pressure still stinging his skin. Across the room, Taehyung stood motionless, sweat glistening at his temple, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that wasn't quite calm. The other members exchanged quiet glances, unsure whether to speak or simply let them have the silence. There was a shift, palpable, magnetic, undeniable. It wasn't just that Jungkook and Taehyung had sung together again. It was the way they had looked at each other while doing it, the subtle tension between each lyric, the soft tilt of Taehyung's head as Jungkook harmonized, the tremble in Jungkook's voice during that one high note he once never missed. They were trying. You could feel it in every beat. Jimin was the first to move, walking over and placing a water bottle by Jungkook's feet without saying a word. He offered a soft smile, one that said he understood without needing to ask. Namjoon exhaled slowly and clapped his hands once, loud enough to bring everyone back to the surface. "Let's take 10, he said, and the room rustled with movement again. Taehyung didn't move toward the others. Instead, he walked to the far window and pushed it open slightly. A breeze slipped in, cooling the back of his neck and pushing his damp hair away from his face. He leaned against the frame and looked out. Jungkook remained by the mic stand, glancing over his shoulder only once before following the others to the far side of the room. But he kept Taehyung in the corner of his eye, like a compass he couldn't quite stop checking. As the others filtered out into the hallway, laughter slowly returning to their voices, Jungkook grabbed a towel and wiped the sweat from his neck. He was about to sit when Taehyung's voice reached him, not loud, but clear. "Come here for a second." Jungkook turned, hesitating just a breath too long before walking across the room. He joined Taehyung by the window, the air between them tight with anticipation and something else. They stood shoulder to shoulder now, gazing out at the city skyline, where the sun had begun to sink, casting Seoul in a wash of tangerine and coral. Taehyung spoke first. "I forgot what this felt like, to sing beside you without the noise between us." Jungkook leaned forward on his forearms, staring into the fading light. It felt like home, for a moment. They stood in silence again, watching the people move far below like ants unaware of the weight of memories held above them. Taehyung turned his face slightly. "Did you mean what you said last night?" Jungkook's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't look away. Every word. Even the part about never walking away again. Jungkook turned to him then, slowly, deliberately, their eyes locking with the kind of intensity that held entire stories. Especially that part. Taehyung didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice cracked just slightly. "Then don't." "I won't," Jungkook said, barely a whisper, like an oath breathed into the wind. For the first time in years, the city didn't feel so loud. The space between them didn't feel so distant. That night they didn't go home immediately. They wandered the city like they used to, slipping into convenience stores for late snacks, laughing over bad jokes, arguing over which ice cream flavor was superior. It was mundane, stupid even, but it was real. It was theirs. For the first time in years, they were just two boys walking Seoul at midnight, invisible in the haze of their own rediscovery. And in those small hours, beneath the flickering lights of alleyway signs and the humming buzz of the late trains, they began to speak of things they'd buried. Taehyung told Jungkook about the nights he'd stayed awake listening to his solo tracks on repeat, headphones tucked under pillows so no one would hear the tears. About the photo he kept of them from their trainee days, creased and fatting, but always with him. Jungkook spoke of the time he nearly walked off stage because he couldn't bear to stand in the same spot where they once stood together. How every award felt hollow without Taehyung's gaze finding his backstage. They didn't try to fix everything, they simply let it surface. The grief, the betrayal, the guilt, the forgiveness. It was ugly and raw and beautiful in its honesty. By the time dawn came again, they were lying on the rooftop of Jungkook's apartment, jackets beneath their heads, watching the sky shift colors like a painting being reworked in real time. Birds chirped in lazy rhythm. The city began to pulse once more beneath them. "I always thought our story would end," Taehyung murmured. "Some friendships change, some fade." Jungkook tilted his head to look at him. "Maybe ours changed, but it didn't end." Taehyung smiled, slow and soft, like the first note of a song he hadn't realized he missed. "No, it didn't." And there in the middle of Seoul, on a rooftop bathed in early light, they made no promises. They didn't need to. Because sometimes what you lose returns in a different form. Not the same, but stronger, wiser, and worth everything. And sometimes change isn't the end. It's the beginning. The city was waking up beneath them, its breath rising in fog from grates and manholes, the pulse of life threading back into its streets like blood returning to a sleeping limb. Jungkook's fingers twitched slightly against the concrete rooftop, cool against his skin. He didn't realize how long they'd been lying there, side by side, saying everything and nothing. The wind ruffled his hoodie as Taehyung shifted beside him, resting one arm under his head as he stared up at the sky, now turning pale gold at the edges. Neither of them moved to leave. The moment felt suspended, like they were living between time zones, neither in the past nor entirely in the present. And for the first time in what felt like years, neither of them were performing. There was no camera, no manager waiting, no script to memorize or lyric to refine. Just two people, two stories still unfolding, reconnecting one thread at a time. Jungkook sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Do you remember when we used to dream about this?" Taehyung glanced sideways. What fame, or this rooftop moment with sore backs and cold air? Jungkook smiled softly. "Both, probably, but I meant the part where we got to do what we love together." "I remember," Taehyung said, sitting up beside him, his knees pulled close to his chest. "Back then, we thought everything would stay the same, that success would mean freedom, that we'd always understand each other." "We were kids," Jungkook murmured. "We didn't know the price. And now we do." They looked at each other, and for a moment, it was just like those first months in the dorm. Sleepless nights, instant noodles, and late conversations about the future that always seemed too far away to touch. Taehyung leaned back on his hands, staring ahead at the skyline. "When I stepped away, it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I didn't know how to stay without hurting more." "I know that now," Jungkook said quietly. "Back then I thought you were done with me, that I didn't matter to you anymore." "You always mattered," Taehyung said, voice breaking just slightly. "That was the problem. I cared too much and I didn't know how to deal with it, so I vanished, and I let you think the worst." Jungkook looked down at his lap, fingers curling slightly. "It changed how I saw myself, how I trusted people. After that, even when people stayed, I kept waiting for them to leave." A painful silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was dense, full of all the nights they didn't speak, the texts left unsent, the songs written but never shown. Taehyung reached out and touched Jungkook's shoulder gently. "I'm still learning how to stay." Jungkook looked at him, the vulnerability stark in his eyes. "Then let's learn together." Hours passed in fragments after that. Breakfast was quiet, simple. takeout sandwiches and coffee from the corner shop neither of them had visited in years. The woman behind the counter blinked when she saw them, but said nothing, only nodded and handed them their change like they were anyone else. And maybe in that moment they were. Just two people with tired eyes and matching clothes, sitting on a bench outside a dusty convenience store, trading bites and staring into the sunlight like it held answers. Later, they returned to the studio. Not because they had to, but because something inside both of them needed to. The others were there already. Jimin curled in a chair by the mirror, Yoongi scribbling something in a notebook, Hosok packing with earbuds in, Namjoon by the window, Jin leaning against the doorframe. They all looked up when Jungkook and Taehyung entered together, walking side by side without space between them. No one said anything. They didn't have to. The tension that had hovered for so long had shifted. Something broken had been acknowledged, and in its place stood something unspoken but understood. The seven of them fell into practice as they always had, messy, brilliant, chaotic, but this time it felt whole again. In between rehearsals, laughter returned, not loud or forced but real. Taehyung teased Jungkook about his hair, Jungkook tossed a towel at him during a water break. They shared lyrics again, hummed harmonies in corners like they used to. Slowly, carefully, they began to build something new, not a replica of what was, but something rooted in truth. That night, Taehyung sent a voice memo to Jungkook, just a soft melody hummed over a simple guitar loop. It was unfinished, a little off-key, but it was raw and real. Jungkook listened to it twice before replying with one of his own, his voice layering over the melody, echoing Taehyung's tune with a counter-harmony. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect, but it was them. In the days that followed, they kept writing, between rehearsals, after shows, in green rooms and taxis. Music became their language again, their way of saying the things they couldn't always speak aloud. And through it, something shifted, not just between them, but in how they saw themselves. One evening, after a long day of filming, they found themselves back on the same rooftop, the city sprawling beneath them like a promise. Taehyung held his phone, scrolling through a gallery of old photos. One of them caught his eye, a picture of him and Jungkook from years ago, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like idiots beneath stage lights. He turned the screen toward Jungkook. "Do you remember this night?" Jungkook laughed softly. "Of course. That was the first night we cried after a show, not from exhaustion, from joy." "We had no idea what was coming," Taehyung said, voice full of wonder and something bittersweet. "No," Jungkook agreed, "but I'm glad we went through it, even the worst parts, because we're still here." Taehyung looked at him then, really looked. "Do you think we'll make it this time?" "I think we already are." There were no fireworks, no dramatic crescendos, just the slow, steady rhythm of hearts trying again. Trust rebuilt not in grand gestures but in showing up again and again without needing to be asked. In shared meals, in unfinished songs, in walking side by side even when the road wasn't straight. And eventually, when they stood on stage again, lights blinding, crowd roaring, world watching, it wasn't the choreography that mattered or the perfect notes. It was the glance they exchanged before the first line, the nod, the smile, the silent understanding that even after everything they had found their way back. Not to who they were, but to who they could become, together. The stage was humming beneath their feet, the vibrations from the subwoofers crawling up through their legs and settling in their bones. Seoul Dome was packed wall to wall, the echo of fans roaring like a storm that refused to die down. Thousands of army bombs swayed like fireflies under the night sky, a galaxy recreated in a single venue, and somewhere within that electric ocean, a memory stirred. One that wasn't distant but present, living, because now it was no longer a ghost. Taehyung stood on Jungkook's left, where he used to stand, and they hadn't spoken a word to each other since stepping on stage, but somehow, that silence meant more than 1,000 apologies. The intro to the next song rolled in like a wave, slow piano, the kind that didn't rush anything, the kind that pulled you under before you knew you were drowning. Jungkook glanced to his right. Taehyung was already looking. There wasn't a signal, no nod, no gesture, just a breath. A shared breath before both their voices entered the same note for the first time in years. And when they sang, it was different. It wasn't perfect. Taehyung's voice cracked on the third line, a tremble that hadn't been there in rehearsals, but Jungkook didn't miss a beat. He leaned into it, adjusted his harmony, let it fold over the imperfection like a shield. And Taehyung felt it. The way Jungkook carried him through it without making it obvious. And suddenly he wasn't standing on a stage with bright lights and cameras pointed at him. He was standing beside Jungkook on a rooftop, under the stars, with nothing but their music and whatever had grown between them. The crowd didn't need to know the story. They could feel it, the shift, the healing, the weight. It was in their eyes, in the way Jungkook leaned just a little closer, in the way Taehyung smiled, not wide, not playful, but something deep and trembling and entirely real. That moment lasted less than 5 minutes, but it was all that mattered. Backstage, after the final bow, after the group hug and the confetti, the air was thick with sweat and joy and exhaustion. Namjoon was talking to staff. Jimin was lying face down on a couch. Jin and Yoongi were pulling at their in-ears and shaking out their shoulders. Taehyung sat on the edge of a black equipment case, sipping water slowly, eyes still half lost in the crowd that had now faded into darkness. Jungkook passed him on his way to change, then stopped. "You okay?" Taehyung looked up, his voice was soft. "You caught me." Jungkook tilted his head. "On stage, when my voice almost gave out, you adjusted." "I always will," Jungkook replied simply. There was a moment between them, heavy and weightless all at once, a moment where they could have said more, but they didn't need to, because the truth was now in the way they walked beside each other, in the way they stayed in the same green room after so many tours of separate dressing spaces, in the quiet glances over meals, in late-night texts that simply read, "Did you get home safe?" Healing hadn't come in fireworks, it had come in mornings, in small actions, in choosing to stay, and they both understood that now. Weeks passed and things began to fall into place, not as they were before, but in a way that was stronger, tempered by pain, shaped by understanding. The two of them began writing again, not just melodies but stories. They pulled long hours in the studio, layering harmonies, arguing over phrasing, laughing until their throats hurt over lyrics that made no sense until they somehow did. One night, well after midnight, they found themselves in that same studio where the first real fracture had begun years ago, the one where the silence between them had once been a chasm. Now it was filled with sound again, with music and movement and breath. Taehyung sat cross-legged on the floor, guitar resting against his knee. Jungkook stood by the console, looping the chorus again and again, brow furrowed in focus. "You still do that thing with your lip when you're concentrating," Taehyung said suddenly. Jungkook looked up. "What thing?" Taehyung mimicked him, slightly exaggerated, lip curled under his teeth. Jungkook laughed. "I do not." "You always have, even in debut days." Jungkook walked over and took the guitar from him, strumming a soft chord. "You still talk to your lyrics when you write them." Taehyung grinned. "Helps them feel less lonely." They wrote until the sun rose. When the demo was finally done, they sat in silence, listening to the playback. It was about change, about distance, about two people finding their way back through the fog. The final verse ended not with a declaration, but with a question. "If I'm still here tomorrow, will you still be the same?" Jungkook turned to Taehyung. "I don't know if we'll always be the same, but I know I'll still be here." Taehyung didn't look away. "Then that's enough." They released the song months later, unannounced. No press, no teaser, just a drop at midnight with a handwritten note in the caption. "For the moments we almost lost everything, and for choosing not to." Fans cried, they speculated, but they knew, the army always knew. And somewhere deep in Seoul, two boys who had once lost each other in the noise of the world sat quietly in a cafe with no disguises, no schedule, and a shared playlist playing softly over the speakers. The world didn't stop, but they had learned how to stand still inside it, together. They had changed, so had their friendship. But some changes are beautiful. And some friendships are worth every storm. The winter wind curled around the narrow street outside the cafe, ruffling the edges of newspapers abandoned on a bench and bending the flame of the small heater beside the outdoor tables. Inside, the glass fogged slightly with warmth and conversation, the occasional clink of ceramic cups breaking through the low hum of music. Jungkook stirred his drink absent-mindedly, eyes fixed on the gentle whirlpool of cream mixing into the espresso, though his thoughts were miles away. Taehyung sat across from him, head tilted as he watched the steam rise from his own cup. Neither of them had spoken in the last few minutes, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the quiet had become its own kind of conversation, the kind that needed no language, just presence. Their jackets hung beside them, scarves still damp with melted snow. Jungkook tapped his fingers against the mug, his gaze finally lifting to meet Taehyung. There was a softness there now, an ease that hadn't been present the first time they'd sat together in silence. This wasn't about repairing something anymore. It was about living in what had been rebuilt. "You know," Taehyung said finally, his voice low and even, "there was a time I thought we'd only speak again in interviews." Jungkook let out a breath that might have been a laugh, or maybe it was just relief. "Yeah, me too." "And I hated the idea," Taehyung added, voice quieter now, "that the only version of us that would survive was the polished one, the one people thought they understood." Jungkook nodded slowly. It was easier to play roles than to admit we failed each other. "But we didn't fail," Taehyung said firmly without hesitation. "We got lost, that's different." Jungkook looked at him for a long moment, something old flickering in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or gratitude. "Thank you for saying that." They sat back in their chairs, letting the warmth soak into them, the cold outside now something distant and harmless. Jungkook pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the Notes app. He didn't say anything, just tilted the screen toward Taehyung, who leaned in to read. It was a verse, bare, unfinished, vulnerable. "We built a house of paper hearts. Tore down the walls to breathe again. But even in ashes I saw your light. Still flickering beneath the rain." Taehyung didn't respond immediately. His fingers reached for the phone, scrolling down to see if there was more. There was, just that one verse. "I wrote it after our first night on the rooftop," Jungkook said. "I didn't know if I'd ever show it to you." Taehyung exhaled slowly, thumb hovering over the last line. "You should finish it." Jungkook raised a brow. "With you." Taehyung smiled, soft and certain. "With me." And so they began again, not just as friends reclaiming what had been lost, but as creators, mirroring one another in rhythm and purpose. Days blurred into nights inside the studio. Papers littered every surface, scribbled lyrics on napkins, guitar strings worn to near breaking. They argued over pre-choruses, rewrote bridges 6 times over, and sometimes sat for hours without playing a single note, just talking, really talking, about the parts of the industry that drained them, about family, about fear, about what it meant to trust someone again after you'd already watched them walk away once. There were moments of doubt, of hesitation. Sometimes one of them would fall silent mid-session, eyes distant. Sometimes the words wouldn't come and it would feel like standing in a room full of ghosts. But every time, without fail, the other would wait, would stay, would listen. That unspoken promise, "I'm here now," wove itself into the music. The song they were writing was no longer about reconciliation. It was about transformation, about how bonds bend and break and sometimes reform in entirely new shapes, how love, platonic, fraternal, foundational, can survive even the coldest silences if someone is willing to thaw the ice. As the track came together, others began to notice. Namjoon poked his head into the studio one night and just stood there, arms crossed, watching them work. I haven't seen you two like this in years, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Jimin walked in later with food and paused in the doorway when he saw Jungkook and Taehyung hunched over the same lyric sheet, their heads nearly touching. You guys scare me when you're this in sync, he teased. Jin brought snacks, Hosuk sat in on harmonies, Yoongi offered to mix. It was like a fire had been lit in the center of their group again, small but steady, burning brighter each day. When the final version of the track was mastered, it didn't need a title. It just needed a moment. They chose to debut it at an intimate fan showcase, no fanfare, no streaming numbers to chase, just a single spotlight, a stripped-down arrangement, and two voices weaving through a melody that belonged to both of them. Before stepping on stage, Jungkook turned to Taehyung backstage. Are you ready? Taehyung didn't answer. He just reached out and clasped Jungkook's wrist, grounding both of them in the present. I was always waiting for this moment. I just didn't know if it would come. They walked out together. The crowd fell into a hush. And when they sang, it wasn't perfect, it was better. Because it was honest. Because it was earned. After the performance, there was no need for explanation. The fans felt it. The ones who had watched the tension through interviews and body language. The ones who noticed when they stood too far apart on stage. The ones who had held their breath for years waiting for a smile, a glance, a laugh that felt real again. They got it that night. The song trended within minutes, not because of its production or a challenge on social media, but because of its truth, because people know when something is real. In the days that followed, interviews came. Journalists asked what inspired the track. Jungkook would glance at Taehyung. Taehyung would smile and say, us, the version of us that got lost, and the one we found again. Their journey didn't end with a song. It continued in quiet ways. Taehyung texting Jungkook late at night about a dream he couldn't shake. Jungkook leaving voice notes with half-written melodies for Taehyung to finish. A new rhythm, not rushed, not forced. Just lived. They traveled again, side by side this time. Not because the schedule said so, but because they wanted to. They shared hotel breakfasts, argued over room temperature, laughed at the same dumb videos on their phones, and occasionally, when no one was looking, they'd drift into conversations that reminded them of who they had once been and how far they'd come. Years later, when asked in a documentary what moment changed everything, Jungkook didn't hesitate. That night, he said, the rooftop, not because of what we said, but because we stayed. Taehyung, sitting beside him, added quietly, and we chose to stay again the next day, and the one after that. Because in the end, some friendships don't survive because they're easy. They survive because someone keeps choosing them. Again and again and again. The rain returned that night, soft and misting like the city itself had something left to say. It whispered against the windows of the van as they drove through quiet streets, Seoul's neon reflections dancing across the slick roads in hues of pink and electric blue. The world outside was blurred, smudged like watercolor, and inside the vehicle it was quiet. Jungkook sat with one arm resting against the foggy window, his breath leaving temporary marks on the glass. Across from him, Taehyung sat curled into the corner, head tilted back, eyes closed, but he wasn't asleep. Jungkook knew that look. He was listening, thinking, turning over something in his mind. The performance earlier had been electric. They'd bared their souls in front of thousands, and the echo of it was still buzzing in their veins. But beneath the adrenaline, there was something gentler threading between them now, a steadiness. They didn't need to say much. The song had said it all. As the van pulled up outside Jungkook's apartment, Taehyung stirred. His gaze met Jungkook in the dim light. And for a brief second, it was like all the years they had lost folded into this one moment of quiet understanding. The driver didn't speak, just nodded politely as they stepped out into the night. They walked the rest of the way in silence, their footsteps syncopated, rhythmic, falling into a pace they hadn't realized they remembered. Jungkook led them up the narrow stairwell, the smell of rain and concrete filling the air. When they stepped into his place, it was still the same. Low lighting, candles half burnt near the piano, a stack of vinyls by the corner, and that one picture frame still on the shelf. The photo was from years ago, grainy and too bright, both of them laughing, sweaty post-rehearsal with ramen bowls in hand. They'd forgotten someone took it, but Jungkook had kept it there through everything. He never moved it. Taehyung walked over and picked up the frame, brushing his thumb across the glass. "You kept this." Jungkook set his bag down, even when I couldn't look at it. Taehyung turned slowly, holding the photo like it might shatter. "I remember that night. We missed the last train and walked 2 hours back to the dorm. We were dead tired," Jungkook added, a soft chuckle escaping. "But you still insisted on getting ice cream." Taehyung set the frame down, his voice quieter, "Because I didn't want the night to end." There was a pause, one of those spaces between words where emotion lived. "You want something to drink?" Jungkook offered, already stepping toward the small kitchen. "Water's fine," Taehyung replied, slipping out of his coat. He wandered the apartment slowly, fingers trailing across the edges of furniture, like he was reacquainting himself with something lost but familiar. Jungkook returned with 2 glasses and handed one over. Taehyung's fingers brushed his, just a touch, but it lingered. "Why didn't we fight harder?" Taehyung asked suddenly, taking a sip without looking up. "Back then, when everything started to fall apart." Jungkook sat down across from him. "I think we were both waiting for the other to come back. I thought if I said something, it would make it worse. I thought if I said something, you'd walk away faster." They both let out a breath at the same time, exhale after exhale, like they'd been holding it for years. Taehyung set his glass down. "We're so stupid sometimes." "But we survived it," Jungkook said, the edge of a smile forming. "That has to mean something." Taehyung looked up. "It means everything." Later, they sat by the window as the rain picked up, watching it streak down the glass in silver threads. Jungkook brought out his notebook, the same one Taehyung had seen on that first night in the studio. It was worn now, pages dog-eared, corners frayed. He flipped to a blank page and handed Taehyung a pen. "Write something." Taehyung raised an eyebrow. "Anything." "Anything." Taehyung hesitated for a moment, then pressed the pen to paper. "I thought I lost you, but maybe I was the one who disappeared first." He slid the notebook back without a word. Jungkook read it once, then twice, the corners of his mouth pulling tight, not a smile, not quite sadness, just something real. He took the pen, added a line below it. "I waited in the silence. I still heard your voice." They looked at each other across the candle-lit room, the rain still murmuring against the glass. The notebook lay open between them now, a new story beginning in ink. They didn't need to fill it tonight. There was time, and more importantly, there was trust again. Sometime past 2 in the morning, Taehyung fell asleep on the couch, legs tangled in a throw blanket, one arm slung over his eyes. Jungkook watched him for a moment, quietly placing a pillow beneath his head and dimming the lights. The apartment was still, warm. For the first time in years, it felt like home again. Days turned into weeks. They kept writing, not just songs but moments. Journals filled with lines they didn't always share, voice memos of melodies hummed in the middle of the night. They began capturing fragments of their rediscovery like puzzle pieces scattered across time. Some days were louder, studio laughter, the chaos of filming schedules, rehearsals that ran too long. Others were quiet, shared meals, long walks, late-night phone calls just to ask how the other was doing. They started showing up for each other in the smallest ways. Jungkook would bring Taehyung coffee without asking, always remembering how much milk he liked. Taehyung would leave behind small doodles on the edge of lyric sheets Jungkook worked on. They didn't talk about what these things meant, but they both knew. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Han River, they sat on the bench where it all began, where silence had once torn them apart. Now it held them together. Taehyung spoke first. I used to think if we drifted again, it would be forever. Jungkook looked out over the water, but we found our way back. And I'm not afraid of the silence anymore, Taehyung added, because I know you're in it. Jungkook turned to him, something unreadable in his eyes. I'll always be in it. Taehyung smiled, reaching into his jacket and pulling out something small, a chain. A pendant, simple, silver, nothing flashy. I had two made, he said. One for me, one for you. Jungkook blinked. Why? To remind us, Taehyung said, slipping it into his hand, that no matter how much we change, some things will always be us. Jungkook didn't say anything. He just closed his fingers around the chain and nodded, the weight of it settling gently against his palm. The sky above them stretched in all directions, streaked with orange and violet. 1,000 lights began flickering across the skyline. The city moved, people passed, time carried on. But on that bench, two souls once split by silence sat together again, changed perhaps but not lost. And that was the truest kind of reunion, one that didn't ask to go back, only forward. Together,